On the coldest Christmas Eve New York had seen in 30 years, Amara Bennett Romano stood in the hallway of a 14-room penthouse, holding a diamond necklace that didn't belong to her, engraved with another woman's name, and made the only decision that had ever been entirely her own. If you've ever loved someone who treated your loyalty like a debt they never intended to repay, stay until the end of this story. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Mud. The coat was hanging by the elevator, the way it always was when Damien came home late and didn't want to wake anyone. Black cashmere, custom fitted, the kind of coat that cost more than most people made in a month. Amara had walked past it twice before something made her stop. Not intuition exactly, more like the particular stillness that comes right before something breaks. She reached into the inner pocket, habit, the same way she'd been collecting dry cleaning receipts and forgotten business cards for 11 years, and her fingers closed around a velvet box. She didn't open it in the hallway. She carried it into the bathroom, the one off the master suite that Damien had never once stepped foot in because he had his own, and she sat on the cold marble floor with her back against the tub and looked at it for a long time before she lifted the lid. The necklace was platinum, oval-cut diamonds, 7 of them, set in a line along a chain so thin it looked like it would dissolve in water. And engraved on the clasp, in letters so small you'd need good light to read them. For my Bianca. Always. D. Amara sat there on that floor for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 because the clock on the wall ticked, and she counted. Not because she was in shock. She'd been in shock before. When she was 23 and first learned what Damien actually did for a living, when she was 26 and found a second cell phone, when she was 28 and miscarried their first pregnancy, and Damien sent flowers from a number she didn't recognize with a card that said thinking of you in handwriting that wasn't his. This wasn't shock. This was something quieter and more final than that. This was the specific grief of a woman who has spent years telling herself the story isn't as bad as it looks, finally accepting that it is exactly as bad as it looks, and that she has known it all along. She put the necklace back in the box. She put the box back in the coat pocket. She went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee, black, and drank it standing at the window looking down at Fifth Avenue where the Christmas lights were blurring in the sleet and the yellow cabs moved slow through the accumulated snow. It was 2:14 in the morning. Damien had told her he was at a meeting with the Caruso brothers in Brooklyn. She hadn't believed him when he said it. She believed it even less now. The twins were asleep in the nursery at the end of the hall. Elias and Eden, 7 months old, sleeping the way infants sleep, completely, without reservation, with no awareness that the world they'd been born into was held together by money that came from places that didn't bear thinking about, and by a man whose name alone was enough to make other men step out of his path in crowded restaurants. Amara set her coffee cup in the sink. She stood in the doorway of the nursery and watched them breathe for a while, her son and her daughter, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatic, not like a breaking, more like a settling. The way ice finally gives way in spring. Slow, and then all at once. She pulled the large duffel from the back of the coat closet, the one she'd packed and repacked in her mind so many times over the past 3 years that the act of actually filling it felt less like a decision and more like completing something she had technically already done. Diapers, formula, the twins' extra onesies and sleep sacks, the medication for Eden's reflux, Elias's small stuffed rabbit that he couldn't sleep without. Her own things were minimal, book. 2 changes of clothes, her passport, the emergency cash she'd been pulling out in 20s and 50s every few weeks, and hiding in a tampon box at the back of the cabinet, a total of $640. She took the small notebook from the nightstand and wrote the note in less than a minute, not because she'd planned the words, but because there weren't that many words to say. Damien, I know who she is. I know what you are. Don't look for us. You won't find us. And if you put your soldiers on the street looking for me, every journalist I can reach will have everything I know about the Romano family's financial operations by the end of the week. I've been paying attention for 11 years. I'm done now. Amara. She left it on his pillow, which was cold because he hadn't slept in it. She lifted Eden first, settled her into the front carrier against her chest, then came back and lifted Elias, who made a small sound but didn't wake. She put him in the carrier on her back. She shouldered the duffel. She took one breath in the doorway of the bedroom she'd shared with Damian Romano for 9 years and looked at the California King and the imported silk curtains and the framed photograph on the dresser. Their wedding portrait, Amara in ivory lace, Damian with his hand at the small of her back, and the particular smile he used for photographs, the one that never quite reached his eyes. And then she walked away from it without looking back again. The elevator was silent. The lobby attendant, Marco, was half asleep at his station, and he looked up when she came through with the babies strapped to her body and the bag over her shoulder, and his face went through several things quickly: confusion, recognition, calculation, and he started to stand. Mrs. Romano. "Merry Christmas, Marco," she said, and she walked through the revolving door and out into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall. 22 degrees and dropping, the wind coming off the park in gusts that drove sleet sideways down the avenue. Eden stirred against her chest and made a small sound of complaint. Amara tucked the edge of her coat more firmly around her daughter's head and walked south, because south was away, and away was the only direction she had. She didn't take a cab from outside the building. She walked 3 blocks, her boots cutting through 6 inches of accumulated snow, the duffel pulling at her shoulder, both babies waking now with the cold, Eden crying in thin, insistent bursts, and Elias starting to wind up behind her. She found a cab on 62nd Street, a driver who didn't look up from his phone when she climbed in, and she told him Penn Station and pressed herself into the corner of the back seat and held Eden's face against her neck and reached back with her free hand to grip Elias's ankle through the carrier, and she did not let herself think about what she was doing. There was no room for thinking right now. There was only the next thing, and then the thing after that. Penn Station at 2:30 in the morning on Christmas Eve had a particular quality to it, the specific fluorescent sadness of a public place that never fully closes, populated by people who had nowhere else to be. Amara bought a ticket to Philadelphia with cash. The clerk barely looked at her. She sat in the waiting area with both babies awake now and fed Eden standing up in the corner near a support column, her coat held around them for privacy, one eye on the doors, watching every face that came through. Nobody who looked like Romano muscle. Not yet. The train left at 3:15. She sat in a window seat near the back of the car, the babies finally asleep again, her duffel tucked under the seat in front of her, and she looked at her own reflection in the dark glass and she thought, "You have $640, 2 infants, and a husband who runs most of Lower Manhattan." She thought, "You have left a note that will make him want to kill you." She thought, "You should be afraid right now." And she was afraid. But underneath the fear, clean and steady as a current under ice, there was something else. She pressed her forehead against the glass and let the cold of it move through her skull. In the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the note sat on the pillow, and the velvet box sat in the coat pocket, and Damian Romano came home at 4:50 in the morning smelling of perfume that wasn't his wife's, and found the bed empty and the nursery empty and a single sheet of paper that made him stand very still for a very long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his head of security. "Find her," he said. "Don't call me again until you have something." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing about Damian Romano that people who didn't know him failed to understand. His violence had never required volume. It operated in the same register as everything else about him: cold, precise, absolute. He poured himself a glass of scotch from the bar cart by the window and stood looking out at the snow, and he was already calculating, already mapping, already moving the pieces across the board in his head. Amara didn't have money. She didn't have allies. He'd made sure of that, slowly, carefully, over the course of 9 years, the way you slowly ensure a door has no hinges. She had nowhere to go that he couldn't reach. He picked up the note again and read it once more, slowly, and his jaw tightened on the word journalist. That was new. That was something he'd underestimated. He folded the note and put it in his breast pocket and drank his scotch and thought about what kind of woman he'd married and whether he'd ever really known her at all. He decided it didn't matter. What mattered was retrieval. What mattered was that she came back. What mattered was that this remained a private matter inside the Romano family because there were already too many people watching. The commission had been restless for months, whispering about him, about his numbers, about the money that had started moving in channels that didn't line up with the family accounts. He didn't need a missing wife and a note threatening the press on top of all of that. He needed her back in this apartment by Christmas morning, and he needed her quiet. He set his glass down and called a man named Carver, who worked for him in a capacity that didn't appear in any organizational chart, and told him to contact the two NYPD detectives on the Romano payroll and have them flag Amara's name across the transit systems: trains, buses, car rentals. He told Carver to pull together a photograph and distribute it to every Romano soldier in the city. He told Carver that when she was found, nobody was to touch the babies, and nobody was to touch Amara until he was there personally. He said this part quietly and clearly, because it was the kind of instruction where clarity mattered. Then he sat down in the chair by the window and waited for the city to tell him where she'd gone. Well, Philadelphia in winter was a different kind of cold than New York, less theatrical, grayer, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply settled in and stayed. Amara checked into a motel off the interstate at 7 in the morning, paying cash, using her middle name and her mother's maiden name at the desk, and she got a room at the end of the ground floor hall with a parking lot view and a heating unit that worked and a bathroom with a lock on the door. And she sat on the edge of the bed with both babies laid in the center of the mattress, and she let herself shake for about 4 minutes. Just that. 4 minutes. Then she stopped. She changed the babies, she fed Elias. She took Eden's reflux medication from the bag and gave her the small measured dose with the dropper and rocked her upright for 20 minutes the way the pediatrician had told her to. And Eden's small body went loose against her shoulder, and she smelled like formula and sleep, and something warm in particular that was just Eden, just herself. And Amara pressed her lips against the top of her daughter's head and held her until her own breathing steadied. The problem was the money. $640 wouldn't last a week with 2 infants, not in a motel, not buying formula and diapers and food. She needed more money, and she needed it without leaving a credit card trail, which meant she needed a person, a specific kind of person, someone outside the Romano sphere of influence, someone who would help her without immediately reporting back. She went through her mental catalog of people she'd known before Damien, and the list was shorter than it should have been, because that was another thing he'd done carefully and over time. Made it inconvenient to maintain old friendships, made it easier to let them go, until the circle around her was composed entirely of people who were his people first. There was one exception. Her college roommate, Delia Washington, who lived in Baltimore and worked as a nurse and who Amara had managed to see twice in the past 5 years, always briefly, always with the specific awareness that Damien allowed these visits rather than approved of them. Delia, who had told her 4 years ago over drinks in a hotel bar while Damien waited in a car outside, "I need you to hear me say this once, and then I'll never say it again. I will always pick up the phone. No matter what time, no matter what's happening, you call me and I will answer." Amara looked at her phone. Damien would have someone monitoring her calls within the hour if he hadn't started already. She looked at the motel room television, its blank screen, the lamp with the pull chain, the clock reading 7:48 in the morning on Christmas Eve, and she made a decision. She walked to the motel office and asked the desk clerk, a teenager, barely awake, headphones around his neck, if there was a payphone within walking distance. He looked at her like she'd asked about a telegraph machine. Then he said there was a gas station 2 blocks down that he thought still had one. It did. Amara stood in the freezing air outside the gas station with Elias in the front carrier and Eden sleeping against her chest, and she called Delia collect, and Delia picked up on the second ring. "It's me," Amara said. A beat. Delia's voice changed. Not alarmed, something more controlled than alarm. The particular steadiness of a person who is absorbing information and deciding simultaneously. "Where are you?" "I need you to not ask me that on this line." "Okay." "I need the thing you said 4 years ago." Silence. 2 seconds. 3. Then, "I meant it. I know you meant it. I'm calling to make sure you still mean it." "I still mean it." No hesitation. "Tell me what you need." "I need a place, 2 or 3 days, and I need to borrow money." "I'll pay you back, I promise you I will." "Amara," Delia's voice was firm and quiet. "Stop. Just tell me where to meet you." They settled on a diner outside Baltimore, close to the interstate, at noon. Amara hung up the phone and stood there for a moment in the cold with the snow coming down, both babies breathing against her in the carrier, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. Not safety. Safety was still a long way off. But the possibility of it. The distant provisional outline of it. She walked back to the motel. She did not know that Damien's man, a detective named Ruiz, who worked out of the Midtown North Precinct and had been on the Romano payroll for 6 years, had already pulled transit records and flagged a cash ticket purchase matching Amara's physical description at Penn Station at 2:47 a.m., destination Philadelphia. She did not know that 2 Romano soldiers were already in a car on the New Jersey Turnpike heading south. She did not know that Damien had, within 3 hours of finding her note, constructed a narrative. Emotionally unstable, history of erratic behavior, took the children without warning, and had an attorney on standby to file emergency family court paperwork the moment the clerk's office opened after the holiday. She didn't know any of this yet. She had a motel room and $600 and a friend in Baltimore and a 2-hour window to figure out her next move. She used the time. She sat at the small desk with a motel notepad and wrote down everything she actually knew about Damien's financial operations. Every number, every name, every meeting she'd overheard, every document she'd seen, the offshore routing she'd found in his home office files 3 years ago when she was looking for the twins' birth certificate documents and found instead a set of accounts that didn't correspond to any legitimate Romano business. She wrote it all down in her tight, careful handwriting, 4 pages of it, and folded those pages and put them in the inside zippered pocket of the duffel. Then she dressed the babies in their warmest layers, repacked the bag, and checked out. Cash. She walked to the nearest bus station and bought a ticket to Baltimore. She sat in the back of the bus with the duffel across her lap and watched the Pennsylvania farmland flatten out into the suburbs of Maryland. And she held Elias with one arm and rested her chin on top of his head, and she thought about Damien's face when he read that note. Not with fear, but with a clear-eyed recognition of what that face had cost her, and what it would cost her still before this was over. The diner outside Baltimore was called Lena's. Red vinyl booths and a counter with spinning stools, and a cook who was clearly not thrilled about working Christmas Eve, but was there anyway. And Delia was in the back booth when Amara walked in, still wearing her hospital badge from the overnight shift, her natural hair pulled back, her face holding the particular expression of a woman who is not going to fall apart because someone has to stay standing. Amara slid into the booth across from her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Delia looked at her, really looked at her, the way people who genuinely know you look, taking in the exhaustion and the set of the jaw and the fact that she'd been walking in snow with 2 babies strapped to her body all night. And then she said very quietly, "You got out." "I got out," Amara said. Delia reached across the table and put her hand over Amara's. Her hand was warm and solid. "Okay," she said. "We'll figure out the rest." They ordered coffee. Amara ordered eggs because she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. Delia watched her eat without comment, occasionally touching Elias's cheek when he reached a hand toward her across the table. And she didn't ask questions yet, because she understood there were things that had to happen in the right order, and eating was one of the first things. When Amara pushed the plate back, Delia said, "How much time do you think you have?" "Before he finds out where I am?" "I don't know. He already knows I went to Philadelphia. Maybe 8 hours. Maybe less. He has people in Philadelphia. He has people everywhere." Delia absorbed this. She picked up her coffee cup and turned it between her palms. "You can't stay at my apartment." "I know. He knows where I live. He knows who I am." It wasn't a statement of fear, just logistics. "But I know someone. She runs a domestic violence shelter in Dundalk. It's a safe location. She keeps it off any public registry. The address isn't findable unless you know who to ask. She owes me a favor from about 3 years back, and it's a big favor." A shelter. Amara said it without inflection, testing the weight of the word. "I know what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything." "You're thinking it's for a different kind of situation." "I'm thinking that wherever I go, I'm bringing his attention with me. If he finds out about a shelter..." "He won't." Delia's voice was firm. "This woman, her name is Carol. She has been hiding women from dangerous men for 22 years, some of them from men with a lot of resources, and she has never had a location compromised. She knows what she's doing. Amara looked out the window. The snow had stopped and the sky was the particular white gray of a winter afternoon that had given up on itself, and the parking lot was empty except for a few cars dusted with fresh snow. She thought about Damien's voice on the phone with his security chief. She thought about how he'd said, find her not as a question or a request, but as a simple statement of expected outcome. The way you say it will rain tomorrow. Not hoping, not asking, just describing what was going to happen. She thought about Elias and Eden. Call her, she said. Delia stepped outside to make the call. Amara stayed in the booth and changed Eden's diaper on the seat beside her, quick and efficient, and ordered a second coffee from the waitress who had seen enough in her years at this particular diner to register no visible reaction to a woman in a winter coat changing a baby in a vinyl booth on Christmas Eve morning. Delia came back in 3 minutes. Carol says come now. She has a room. Amara left cash on the table and picked up her babies and her bag, and they walked out into the parking lot together. Delia had pulled her car around to the door, a 10-year-old Honda with a car seat already in the back that belonged to her nephew, and she helped Amara strap Eden in and then Elias, checking the buckles with the serious efficiency of someone who worked pediatrics. And then she went around and got behind the wheel. You should eat something, Amara said, because it had been an overnight shift and she'd met her at a diner and had only coffee. I'll eat later. Delia put the car in reverse. Right now I'm taking you somewhere safe. The shelter was in a row house on a street in Dundalk that looked like every other street in Dundalk. Narrow sidewalks, formstone facades, trash cans at the curb, and Carol was a heavy-set white woman in her late 50s with a gray braid down her back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the specific manner of someone who had stopped being impressed by crisis about 15 years ago and now simply processed it. She met them at the side door, not the front, and she took the duffel from Amara's shoulder without being asked and led them up a back staircase to a room on the second floor with 2 twin beds and a crib and a window with a heavy curtain that she drew without explanation. Phones, she said. Amara handed her the cell phone without argument. I'll put it in the office downstairs. Keep the SIM active so the signal still pings from this building. Anyone tracking it will see you're stationary here. There's a burner in the nightstand drawer, so what? Single number programmed in. That's my line. She looked at Amara with the steady appraising attention of someone reading a situation quickly. You hungry? I ate. The babies? They're fine, Carol nodded. She looked at Elias, who was studying her with the grave attention of a 7-month-old encountering a new face. Handsome, she said, with the same flat practicality as everything else. There's formula in the kitchen cabinet on the left, diapers in the closet, size newborn through 12 months. Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6. We don't answer the front door and we don't open the curtains. She paused at the door. You'll be okay here. I've kept women safe from men with a lot more resources than a New York crime boss. She said it without drama, as a simple fact, and she closed the door behind her. Amara stood in the center of the room. The crib had a small mobile over it, pastel animals, turning slowly in the heat from the radiator. She laid Elias in it, then Eden, and they settled against each other the way they always did, immediately and completely, like they'd been in exactly the right place the whole time and had only been waiting to arrive. She sat on the edge of one of the twin beds and put her head in her hands, not crying, just breathing, just taking stock of the fact that it was 2 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and she was in a safe house in Dundalk, Maryland, with $600 and 2 infants and a husband who had the NYPD and the entire Romano network looking for her. She thought about the 4 pages folded in the zippered pocket of the duffel. She thought about what she knew and how much of it was verifiable, and who in this city might be interested in a very specific set of financial records that pointed directly to Romano money moving through accounts that 3 other Mafia families had reason to care about. She thought, I am not just running. I have to become something more than a woman running. She pulled the duffel onto her lap and unzipped it and took out the notebook she'd packed. Small, spiral-bound, the kind she'd used for grocery lists. And she started to write. Not the financial details. Those were already on the 4 pages. This was different. This was a timeline. Every lie she could date. every absence she could account for, every conversation she'd overheard that she hadn't been supposed to hear, every name she'd filed away, every meeting that didn't match the story she'd been given. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she switched hands and kept writing. Outside, the light was failing. The winter afternoon was collapsing into early dark, the way it did in December, without warning, the sky going from gray to charcoal to black in what felt like minutes. Inside the shelter, someone downstairs was cooking something. Soup, maybe, or stew, and the smell of it came up through the floor, warm and ordinary. Elias made a small sound in the crib. Amara looked up. He wasn't awake, he was doing the thing he did in his sleep sometimes. A brief vocalization, some interior navigation she'd never be able to track. She watched him for a moment. His sister had one small fist pressed against his cheek, unaware. The mobile turned above them. Amara set the notebook down. She picked up the burner phone from the nightstand and turned it over in her hand. One number programmed in, Carol's line. She thought about the 4 pages again. She thought about who she could trust to tell her what those pages were worth, strategically, not just to a journalist but to the right kind of person. She thought about the kinds of men who existed in the space alongside the Romano family, the ones who had their own reasons for wanting the Romano Empire destabilized, the ones who operated by their own code and might, under the right circumstances, see a woman with information as an asset rather than a liability. She didn't have a name yet, but she felt the outline of the possibility. She put the phone down and lay back on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to her children breathe in the dark, and she thought, tomorrow is Christmas Day. The day after that, the world starts moving again. So does Damien. You have one day. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, or she didn't think she slept, but somewhere in the dark of that room, in that house on that street in Dundalk, Maryland, the hours moved and the night deepened, and in New York City, Damien Romano stood in his empty apartment with a glass of scotch going warm in his hand, staring at the Christmas lights on Fifth Avenue, and he was already on his 4th phone call of the night, tightening the net. By morning, he had a name. Philadelphia, then the transit record to Baltimore. He didn't have an address yet, but Baltimore was a city, not a country, and he had people. What he didn't have, what he couldn't have known, standing in his penthouse, with his particular cold certainty that retrieval was simply a matter of time and resources, was that somewhere in a city he was already converging on, a woman he'd spent 9 years underestimating was sitting in the dark with a notebook full of everything he'd ever tried to hide, deciding who she was going to become. Christmas morning came into the shelter the way bad news always does, quietly, without announcement, the light through the heavy curtain going from black to gray to a pale and indifferent white. Amara was awake before it happened. She'd been awake most of the night, moving between the notebook and the crib, feeding Eden at 2 and Elias at 4, lying on the bed between feedings with her eyes open and her mind running the same calculations over and over until the numbers stopped producing new answers. She heard the shelter come to life below her, water through old pipes, the sound of the kitchen, someone's voice low and even. She changed both babies, dressed them in the warmer of their 2 sets of clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed with the 4 pages of financial notes spread across the mattress in front of her, reading them again in the gray morning light. Names, account numbers, routing codes, dates. The shape of a criminal architecture she'd assembled in secret over 3 years, pulling thread after thread from conversations she wasn't supposed to be having and documents she wasn't supposed to be seeing, storing it all in the particular part of her mind she'd learned to keep very quiet and very separate from the woman she performed as Damien's wife. She folded the pages. She put them back in the duffel. Carol knocked at 7:15. She didn't wait for an answer, just opened the door and stood in the frame with 2 cups of coffee and looked at Amara and the babies and the general state of the room with the practiced assessment of a woman who had seen every variation of this particular morning and registered none of them as extraordinary. "You sleep?" "Some." Carol handed her a cup. She looked at the duffel on the floor, the notebook on the bed. "You've been working." "Thinking?" "Same thing." Carol sat in the chair by the window without being invited. "The phone I gave you." You use it yet? No? You have someone to call? Amara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was hot and real, and she focused on that for a moment before she answered. I'm trying to figure out the right move. I have information about my husband's operation, financial records, account numbers, the structure of how he moves money. I need to figure out who it's most useful to and how to get it to them without making myself a target in the process. Carol looked at her steadily. Law enforcement. His people own law enforcement. 3 detectives at Midtown North that I know of by name. Probably more, I don't know. Federal? Maybe. I don't know enough about who he's gotten to at that level. Then you need someone to broker it for you. Carol said it the way she said everything, flatly, as a statement of logistics. Someone who understands what you have and how to position it. I need someone who isn't afraid of the Romano name. Carol was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup. I know a woman. Attorney, retired now. She worked organized crime cases for 12 years with the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district. She lives in Roland Park, maybe 20 minutes from here. She's not afraid of anything that walks on 2 legs, and she doesn't owe anyone in the Romano family a single thing. She paused. I can call her. It's Christmas morning. She'll be home. I don't want to pull more people into this. You're already pulling people into it. Carol said it without judgment. That's how this works. You can't do this alone with 2 7-month-olds and $600. The question is who you pull in and how. She stood up. I'll make the call. You don't have to say yes. She left. Amara drank her coffee and looked at her children, who were watching the mobile rotate above them with the total absorption that infants bring to everything, as if the turning of 3 plastic giraffes was the most significant event that had ever occurred. She thought about Damien waking up in New York this morning, Christmas Day. She thought about what he would do with the holiday, whether he would observe it at all or simply continue the machinery of finding her. She already knew the answer to that. He would continue. Damien Romano didn't pause for anything as imprecise as a calendar. Carol came back in 8 minutes. She'll see you at 10. The attorney's name was Margaret Osei, and she lived in a brick colonial on a street where the houses were old and serious and set back from the road behind bare winter trees. She answered the door herself, which told Amara something. 60, maybe 62. A Ghanaian-American woman with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of men who didn't want her there and had simply declined to be moved by it. She looked at Amara in the doorway, the babies, the duffel, the specific kind of exhaustion that is different from tiredness, and she stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, she said. I made tea. You look like you need something hot. The house was warm and smelled like cardamom. They sat at the kitchen table, Elias in Amara's lap, and Eden in a bouncy seat that Margaret produced from a closet with the efficiency of someone who had grandchildren and was accustomed to accommodating small people on short notice. Margaret poured tea and sat across from Amara and folded her hands on the table and said, Carol told me the broad strokes. Tell me the rest. Amara told her. She was precise and unsentimental about it. The marriage, the structure of the Romano family's operations as she understood it, the financial record she'd compiled, the note she'd left, the timeline she'd laid out in the notebook. She told it the way she'd been telling it to herself in her head all night, stripped of anything personal, as a sequence of facts and their logical consequences. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making a very small sound that indicated she was following but not reacting. When Amara finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. The account numbers, she said. You have them with you? Amara took the 4 pages from the duffel and put them on the table. Margaret put on her reading glasses and read them slowly, all the way through, without speaking. When she finished, she set the pages down and took her glasses off and looked at Amara across the table. You understand what this is? I understand what I think it is. What you think it is, Margaret said, is a man laundering approximately $30 to $40 million annually through a series of shell companies in 3 jurisdictions, routing the proceeds through accounts that don't appear in any filing associated with the Romano family's known business holdings. And, based on the timing of the dates you've noted here, doing this in a way that directly defrauds at least two allied crime families of revenue they believe they're entitled to. She tapped the pages. What I know it is leverage. Significant leverage if it's verified. The question is leverage over whom, deployed through which channel, and in whose interest. I'm not interested in leverage, Amar said. I'm interested in my children being safe. Those are the same thing. Margaret said it gently, but without softening it. You want safety. You need power. You have no money, you have no bodyguards, and you have a husband who has NYPD resources and a criminal organization actively looking for you. What you do have is these pages. You have to decide what they're worth and who they're worth them to. She paused. Law enforcement is one option, federal level, not local. The U.S. Attorney's Office or the FBI's Organized Crime Division. What you have here would be of significant interest to them. How long does that process take? To turn these documents into protection for you? Months, possibly longer. And in the meantime, you're in protective custody with two infants, which is its own set of problems. Amara looked at the pages on the table. What's the other option? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She picked up her teacup. There are people in the organized crime landscape who have their own reasons to want Damian Romano's operation compromised. Rival families who've been cut out of the profits he's supposed to be sharing. Senior figures who've been watching him build a private empire at the commission's expense and are already looking for a mechanism to act on it. She set the cup down. If the right information reached the right person, someone with standing and authority within that world, it would move considerably faster than any legal process. And it would move with considerably more immediate consequence for Damian. You're talking about going to another crime family. I'm talking about going to a specific person, Vincent DeLuca. She said the name simply, without drama. He's the head of the DeLuca organization, older family, more disciplined. They operate on the outer boroughs and parts of New Jersey. He's been on the commission for 14 years, and he has a reputation for two things. He keeps his word, and he doesn't tolerate people who steal from their own. She paused. I dealt with him once, obliquely, during a case that touched the boundary of his organization. He's not a good man in any conventional sense of the word, but he has a code that he actually follows, which makes him something rarer than a good man in that particular world. He's a predictable one. And you think he'd help me. I think he'd help himself, and helping you would be the mechanism for doing it. Margaret's voice was precise. That's not the same thing as altruism, but in your situation, the outcome is similar. Amara sat with that for a moment. Elias was pulling at the collar of her shirt, fingers closing and opening in the absent way of a child who isn't hungry but wants the reassurance of contact. She wrapped her hand around his, and he gripped her index finger and held on. How do I reach him? She said. I can make a call, Margaret said. I do it as an intermediary, only I'm not going back into that world, and I want that understood. But I can make an introduction, and I can tell him what you have. Whether he agrees to meet you is his decision. Do it, Amar said. In New York, Christmas morning was not going well for Damian Romano. His head of security, a thick-necked man named Patrice, who had worked for the family for 19 years, stood in the living room of the Fifth Avenue penthouse at 9 in the morning and delivered his report in the flat, careful tone of a man who knows the news is bad, and has organized it to be as survivable as possible. She's in Baltimore, Patrice said. We tracked the transit record from Philadelphia to Penn Station, Baltimore. We don't have a specific address. She's not using her phone. The signal's been stationary at a location in Dundalk since approximately 8 last night, but when we sent someone to check the location, it was a row house. No one answered. She left the phone there, Damian said. That's what it looks like. Damian was standing by the window. He hadn't slept. He'd had more scotch than was useful, and then switched to coffee around 3 in the morning and was now in that particular state of exhaustion that had burned through to something like cold clarity on the other side of tiredness. He looked out at Fifth Avenue, which was empty, which was the only time Fifth Avenue was ever empty, and he thought about Amara's handwriting on that note, the steadiness of it. He'd read it a dozen times since he found it, and that steadiness kept catching at something in him. Not guilt, he was past the geography of guilt, but something like recognition, He'd known she was more capable than she appeared. He'd known it and relied on it, and then, somewhere in the past 9 years, had confused her patience for passivity. That was the mistake. He could see it clearly now. It was a clean mistake, the kind you could trace back to a specific failure of attention, and it didn't make him feel anything soft. It made him want to correct it. "The 2 men I sent to Baltimore," he said. "Where are they now?" "Holding position. I told them to wait." "What about Ruiz?" "Working it. He's got feelers out with Baltimore PD, but it's a holiday. It's slow going." Damien turned from the window. His face was composed the way it always was, which was the thing people described when they described him as frightening, not volatility, the opposite of volatility, the absolute stillness of a man who has long since stopped needing to perform anger in order to act on it. "I want 10 more men in Baltimore by tonight. I want Ruiz on the phone with every contact he has down there, and I want a file, medical records, anything I can use to establish instability, erratic behavior. If this goes to family court, I want to walk in with documentation." Patrice nodded. He started to leave. "Patrice?" Damien's voice stopped him at the door. "The note she left. The part about the journalists." He paused. "She's not bluffing." Patrice turned back. He looked at his boss for a moment. "What do you want me to do about that?" "I want you to find out what she knows and how much of it she can actually prove." He turned back to the window. "Before she shows it to someone who can use it." What Damien didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the call had already been made, that Margaret Osai, 12 miles from the shelter in Dundalk, had picked up a specific phone at 9:45 on Christmas morning and called a number she'd kept in a locked drawer for 3 years against the possibility that she might someday need to reach the DeLuca organization through a channel that didn't leave a traceable record. That the call had been received, routed, and returned within the hour. That Vincent DeLuca, who was spending Christmas morning at a house in Essex County, New Jersey, had listened to a 2-minute summary of the situation and asked 3 questions. What specifically does she have? Is it verifiable? And is she stable? And upon receiving answers that satisfied him on all 3 counts, had agreed to a meeting. Amara got the news from Margaret at 11:30. She was sitting on the floor of the shelter room with both babies on a blanket in front of her, running a soft rattle from one set of reaching hands to the other, and she held the burner phone against her ear and listened. "He'll meet you," Margaret said. "Tonight. There's a restaurant in Fells Point. It's closed for the holiday, but he'll have it opened. He'll come with 2 people, and he expects you to come alone." "I'm not leaving the babies." "I told him that. He said bring them." Amara was quiet for a moment. She looked at Elias, who had gotten hold of the rattle and was examining it with tremendous concentration. "What do you know about him?" "I told you what I know." "Tell me what you think." Margaret was quiet for a beat, then, "I think he's a man who has operated in a world full of people who break their own rules and has survived by never breaking his. That makes him either the most dangerous kind of man or the most trustworthy kind, and sometimes in his world those aren't different things." A pause. "I think you don't have better options tonight." "I know I don't." "Then go, Chad." The restaurant in Fells Point was called Ardea, and it was the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside. Just a number on a black door on a cobblestone street 2 blocks from the water. Amara arrived at 7:30 in a car Carol had arranged, an old Buick driven by a woman named Sandra, who asked no questions and received a folded set of instructions from Carol before they left. The street was empty, the cobblestones glazed with ice, the harbor a black presence at the end of the block. The door opened before she reached it. A man she didn't know, late 40s, compact, wearing a dark coat with no expression on his face, held it open and stepped aside without speaking. She went in. The restaurant was dim, lit mostly by the candles on the tables and a low light behind the bar. It smelled like olive oil and aged wood and a fire burning somewhere she couldn't see. There were 2 men standing near the bar. One of them she didn't recognize, younger, watchful, positioned near the back wall. The other was seated at the table in the center of the room, and he stood when she came in, and that was Vincent DeLuca. He was not what she'd expected, although she realized afterward she hadn't constructed a clear expectation. 60 or close to it, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had probably never been conventionally handsome, but had become more significant with age. Heavy-browed, watchful, with the specific quality of stillness she'd come to associate with men who were used to rooms rearranging themselves around their presence. He was dressed simply. No jewelry. He looked at her, and then he looked at the babies in the carriers against her body, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, the way a man recalibrates when the situation presents itself as more human than expected. "Mrs. Romano," he said. His voice was even and low. "Amara," she said. She wasn't using that name anymore. She'd decided that in the car. He registered this. "Sit down," he said. "There's food. I had someone come in. You should eat." "I'm not here to eat." "I know why you're here." He sat back down himself, which was a kind of signal. "Sit anyway." She sat across from him. Elias, against her chest, had gone very quiet in the way he did in new environments, watchful, taking inventory. Eden was asleep. The man by the back wall didn't move. The man who'd let her in had disappeared somewhere behind her. Vincent looked at her across the table and he said, "You have documentation of your husband's financial operations, account numbers, routing structures, the mechanism of how he moves money outside the commission's ledgers." "Yes." "How long have you been collecting it?" 3 years. "And you kept it?" Not a question. "I kept it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that assessing stillness. "Why?" "Because I knew someday I'd need it or I'd need to burn it, and I didn't know which yet." The corner of his mouth moved, barely. It wasn't a smile. It was the expression of a man who has heard a large number of answers to questions and found very few of them interesting, encountering one that was. He reached across the table and a manila folder was there. She hadn't seen him put it there. It had been under his hand, and he pushed it toward her. "Open it." She opened it. Inside were photographs, financial documents, printed records. She recognized some of the account numbers immediately, the same ones from her own 4 pages. "We've been building a case against your husband for 2 years, Vincent said. Not a legal case, a commission case. He's been stealing from 3 allied families. Not skimming, not adjusting numbers in his favor, stealing. Moving money out of shared operations into accounts that exist only for his benefit. He's been using those funds to build a private enforcement structure that doesn't report to the commission and doesn't operate by commission rules." He paused. "What you have might fill the gaps in what we have. Taken together, what you're looking at would be sufficient to bring before the commission and make a case that results in the Romano organization being dismantled." "And Damien," she said. Vincent looked at her with the directness of a man who wasn't going to manage this part. "Dealt with, according to commission process." "What does that mean?" "It means stripped of position, stripped of operation, removed from any standing in this structure. What happens after that depends on choices he makes." He was precise about this in the way of a man who knows the difference between a promise and a projection. "I'm not going to make you a guarantee about a specific outcome. What I can guarantee is that if the commission acts, the Romano family ceases to function as a protective structure for him, which means the apparatus he's using to hunt you disappears." Amara set her hands flat on the table. She looked at the documents in the folder. She thought about the 2 Romano soldiers who were somewhere in this city right now, working through the grit of it, knocking on doors. She thought about Ruiz and his Baltimore contacts. She thought about the family court filing that Damien had certainly already initiated. She thought about $600 and a shelter room and 2 babies and the specific mathematics of how long she could sustain this before something gave way. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Your documentation, your account numbers, the routing structure, the dates. In exchange, my organization provides you with a safe location, not a shelter, a house, with security that is not penetrable by Romano soldiers or Romano-connected law enforcement. You stay there with your children until the commission meeting, which I'm convening within the next 10 days. After the commission acts, you're free. Romano's network has no mechanism to pursue you without him at the center of it. And if the commission doesn't act the way you expect..." He was quiet for a moment. "It will." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her with the particular respect of one serious person for another. If the commission fails to act, which I don't anticipate, then you use what you have with the federal authorities, which I understand you've already discussed as an option. You're not giving up that option by sharing the information with me. I'm not asking for exclusivity. I'm asking for what you have in exchange for 10 days of protection. He paused. That's the offer. Amara looked at him. She thought about Margaret's words. Not a good man in any conventional sense, but a predictable one. She thought about the gap between those two things and whether that gap was navigable from where she was sitting. She reached into the duffel and took out the 4 pages and set them on the table. Vincent didn't pick them up immediately. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at her. You're sure? I've been sure since I left New York, she said. I just needed to find the right room to be sure in. He picked up the pages. He read them with the steady attention of a man who reads financial documents frequently and under pressure. When he finished, he set them down and looked up, and she could see the shift in his expression. Something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite surprise, but lived in the territory between them. These fill the gaps, he said. I know they do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call, brief, in Italian she didn't fully follow, and set it down. He looked at her across the table. There's a house in Ellicott City. My people will take you tonight. You'll have 2 men on the perimeter, They'll change every 12 hours. No one from the Romano family knows that location or has any connection to anyone there. Amara nodded. I have one question, Vincent said. He said it in the tone of a man who was adding something outside the formal transaction. In 9 years, was there ever a version of him that was worth the time? She looked at him across the candlelit table in the empty restaurant on Christmas night in a city that wasn't hers, her son's weight against her chest, her daughter sleeping at her side, and she thought about the question with the full attention it deserved. There was a version of who I thought he was, she said. That version was worth the time. The man who actually exists never was. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, which was the signal that the meeting was over. My car will take you to Ellicott City. Your phone? The burner. Call only that number. If anything changes on my end, you'll hear from me within the hour. He paused. Merry Christmas, Amara. She stood. She resettled Elias in the carrier and picked up the duffel and looked at this man who was not an ally and not a protector, and not anything she could name cleanly, who had just become the most important person standing between her children and the machinery her husband was deploying to find them, and she said, Don't make me regret this. He held her gaze. I won't, he said. She walked to the door. The man in the dark coat was waiting. Outside, the cobblestones were empty, and the harbor was black, and somewhere in New York a man was tightening a net that had, as of tonight, developed a significant hole. But that night, in a motel 40 minutes away, one of Damien's men, a soldier named Trey, who'd been working the Baltimore grid since morning, sat down at a bar and ordered a beer and pulled out his phone and called Patrice and said he had something, not an address but a contact, a nurse in Dundalk who'd been seen with a woman matching the description, and he had a name. Patrice called Damien. Damien Romano said, Get me on a plane to Baltimore. And the net, which had developed a hole, began to pull tight again from a different direction, faster now, with the particular momentum of a man who has stopped being patient and started being angry, which was the most dangerous version of Damien Romano that existed, and which Amara, riding in the back of a dark car toward a house she'd never seen, did not yet know was coming. The house in Ellicott City was a colonial on a cul-de-sac behind a stand of old oaks, the kind of neighborhood where nothing moved at night and the streetlights came on at dusk and stayed on until morning. DeLuca's men had it ready when she arrived, heat running, refrigerator stocked, a crib assembled in the upstairs bedroom with the precision of people who had been given specific instructions and followed them without interpretation. 2 men outside, one at the front corner of the house and one at the back fence line, rotating in silence every 12 hours. They didn't speak to her beyond the initial brief exchange at the door, and she didn't ask them to. She settled the babies that first night with the particular focused efficiency she'd developed over the past 48 hours. The way crisis either disintegrates a person or compresses them into something harder and more functional. Eden took her medication and went down without protest. Elias fought it for 20 minutes, overstimulated by the new environment, and she walked him in slow circles around the unfamiliar bedroom until he went loose against her shoulder and she laid him in the crib beside his sister and stood there in the dark for a moment with her hands braced on the crib rail, listening to them breathe. Then she went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and tried to figure out how compromised she already was. Delia was the thread. She knew it. The soldier who'd flagged her to Patrice had gotten a name. Delia Washington, Dundalk, nurse. That was the shape of it, which meant Damien now had a line of inquiry that connected Amar's disappearance to a specific person. And from that person, the line could extend to Carol, to the shelter, to Margaret Osei, and potentially to whatever trace remained of the meeting in Fells Point. The question was how fast and how clean his people moved, and whether the gap between what he knew and what he could act on was wide enough for 10 days. She didn't think it was. She picked up the burner and looked at the single program number and set it back down. It was past midnight. Whatever was moving in Damien's operation was moving without her ability to track it, and calling Vincent DeLuca at midnight on Christmas night to express anxiety was not a move that served her. She needed information, not reassurance. Those were different things, and she'd learned the hard way that reaching for reassurance when you needed information was how you ended up surprised. She thought about Delia. She thought about the fact that Delia didn't know where she was. She'd been careful about that, hadn't told her about Vincent or Ellicott City or any of the specific steps after the diner. Delia knew she was safe, knew she had help. That was all. Which meant if Damien's people got to Delia, the most she could give them was a diner outside Baltimore and a retired attorney in Roland Park. Would that be enough to find her? Maybe. If Damien's reach extended to Margaret Osei's phone records, if it extended to whoever had opened Ardea restaurant on Christmas night, if the cobblestones in Fells Point had eyes she hadn't seen. She sat with that for a long time. Then she put her head down on her arms on the kitchen table and she slept without deciding to, the way exhaustion eventually overrides even the most wired and vigilant mind, and she slept for 4 hours without moving. She woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of her burner phone buzzing against the table. She had it to her ear before she was fully upright. Yes, it's Vincent. His voice was the same as it had been in the restaurant, even low, entirely without urgency, which was its own kind of signal. A man like this didn't lose his register when things were fine. He also didn't lose it when things were not fine. The evenness told her nothing except that he was in control of himself. We have a problem. She was completely awake now. Tell me. My people tracked Romano movement into Baltimore last night. He came himself, not soldiers, not Patrice, him. He landed at BWI at 11:50 and he has 6 men with him. A pause. He knows you're in the area. He doesn't have the Ellicott City address yet, but he's working a contact at Baltimore PD who's pulling credit and cell records on anyone in your known network. Delia. Your friend, yes, and the attorney. Another pause. The attorney's careful. She won't have left anything traceable. But your friend made a call from her personal cell to a number registered to the shelter in Dundalk at approximately 9 yesterday morning. If Romano's contact pulls her records, he gets Carol, Amar said. He gets the shelter. And from the shelter, if he applies enough pressure. How much time? Hours, not days. He said it without apology, just information. I'm moving the commission meeting up. I've already contacted 3 members. I can convene an emergency session in 2 days if necessary, but I need you safe until then, which means you cannot stay in that house. Amara looked at the dark kitchen, the unfamiliar cabinets, the refrigerator with its DeLuca stocked shelves. Where? I'm sending a car at 7. There's a property in Pennsylvania, western side, outside a town called Ligonier. Rural, isolated, nothing near it. Romano doesn't have the manpower to canvass that geography, and he doesn't have enough time even if he did. His voice remained level. Pack what you need. The car will be a black Ford, 2 men. They'll identify themselves by first name, Marco and Deshawn. Do not get in any other car. Understood. Amara. He said her name the way he'd said it in the restaurant, as a statement, as a marker. I know this is not what you planned. Nothing about any of this is what I planned. No, he said. But you're still moving. That matters. He ended the call. She put the phone down and sat for exactly 30 seconds in the dark kitchen of a house she was about to leave, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, the compression of it, the relentlessness of it, the specific exhaustion of being hunted by someone with unlimited resources while caring for 2 infants on her body and $600 in a bag. She let herself feel all of that for 30 seconds, and then she stood up and went upstairs and began to pack. Damian Romano sat in the back of a black SUV on a street in Dundalk, Maryland at 6 in the morning on December 26th, and he looked at a row house through the tinted window, and his jaw was tight in a way that hadn't loosened since he'd landed at BWI. He'd found the shelter. It had taken Ruiz's contact at Baltimore PD 4 hours and one very specific records request, and it had cost him $20,000 wired to an account in the Cayman Islands. But he had the address. He didn't storm it. That wasn't how he operated. And beyond that, it would have been counterproductive. A domestic violence shelter full of women on Christmas night was the kind of scene that generated attention he couldn't afford. So he'd sat across the street and waited, and at 6:15, Carol came out the side door to take the recycling to the curb, and 2 of his men were out of the car before Patrice could say anything, and they brought her to the SUV with a hand on each arm and no conversation. She sat in the back with Damian, and she was not afraid, which he noticed and registered without comment. She was a heavy-set woman with a gray braid and reading glasses on a chain, and the face of someone who had been in this category of situation before and had decided a long time ago that fear was an inefficient response to it. Mrs. He started. Carol, she said flatly. Just Carol. Carol. He looked at her with the full force of his attention, which was considerable. I'm looking for my wife and my children. That's all this is. That's never all it is, Carol said. His jaw moved. She was here. A lot of women come through here. This one left last night with 2 infants. I need to know where she went. I don't track where women go after they leave. That's the point. He looked at her for a long moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a photograph. Amara, from their last family event, standing in a garden in Connecticut with her hair pinned up and a slight expression of contained impatience that he'd always read as serenity and was now reconsidering. He held it toward Carol. Carol looked at the photograph. She looked at Damian. I can't help you, she said. You're going to help me. He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd said it with heat. The question is just what it costs you. I've been doing this for 22 years, Carol said. Men like you have walked through that door or sat outside it or sent people to sit outside it for 22 years. I'm still here. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you think you're going to do to me is less than what some of them have done, and I'm still here. Damian looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not respect, not softness, more like the recalibration of a man who has encountered an unexpected resistance and is deciding whether to go through it or around it. He decided around. The attorney, he said. Margaret Osei, Roland Park. He watched her face. Saw the smallest movement. Not much, barely anything, but it was there. A ripple of something she hadn't fully controlled. You made that connection. Carol's face went still. Thank you, Damian said. He leaned forward and opened the SUV door from the inside and held it open. You can go. Carol got out. She stood on the Dundalk sidewalk in the cold morning air and watched the SUV pull away, and she went inside and picked up her phone and called the number she had for Margaret Osei, which rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she called again and again. But Margaret Osei had turned her phone off at 2 in the morning and hadn't turned it back on. She was awake at 6:30, making coffee in her kitchen in Roland Park, when the knock came at her front door. She stood very still for a moment with the coffee pot in her hand. The knock was not aggressive. It was polite, measured, the kind of knock that had been practiced at being polite and measured. She set the pot down. She opened the door because she had spent 30 years making decisions about when to be afraid and when not to be. And in her own doorway on her own street, in the early morning light, she made the decision not to be. She would examine later whether that was wisdom or pride. Damian Romano was taller than she'd expected. He stood on her front step in a dark overcoat with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at her with eyes that were a very clear gray and entirely without warmth, and he said, "Dr. Osei, I apologize for the hour." "No, you don't," she said. His mouth moved. "No," he agreed. "May I come in?" "No." He absorbed this. "I want to know where my wife is. I believe you can help me with that." "I can't help you with that." "You brokered a meeting," he said, "between my wife and Vincent DeLuca." He said it the way he'd said everything else, not as a question, not as an accusation, as a fact being confirmed. "I want to know what they agreed to." Margaret looked at him. She thought about Amara on the other side of her kitchen table yesterday morning, her infant son in her lap, her hands flat on the table, her voice precise and stripped of everything except the essential information. She thought about the 4 pages of financial records and the specific weight of what they represented, and the decision Amara had made to hand them across a restaurant table to a man she'd only just met. "I'm an attorney," Margaret said. "I don't discuss clients." "She's not your client." "She's under my advice, which is close enough for my purposes." She held the door with one hand. "Mr. Romano, you need to go." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that were doing something complex behind their surface stillness. Then he said, "DeLuca. Just the name. Quiet. He's moving against me." "I don't know anything about that." "You know exactly what you helped arrange." He took one step back, which was a kind of concession or the performance of one. "I'm going to find her. That's not a threat. It's a description of what is going to happen. But you should know what she thinks she's given DeLuca, the information she thinks protects her. There are things about that situation she doesn't understand." He paused. "Things about DeLuca she doesn't understand." Margaret kept her face still. "What things?" "Ask her," he said. "If you talk to her, ask her who Bianca Russo is and why she matters to Vincent DeLuca." He walked back down the front steps. A car was waiting at the curb. He got in and it pulled away, and Margaret stood in her doorway in the cold morning air with the specific sensation of a woman who has just been given a piece of information in the shape of a question, and she closed the door and went to her phone and turned it on and found 4 missed calls from Carol and called her back. Carol answered on the first ring. "He was here," she said. "He was here too," Margaret said. A silence. Then, "The name DeLuca. He brought it up?" "Yes." Margaret picked up her coffee cup, set it down. "Carol," he said something about the woman DeLuca's known to be connected to, Bianca Russo. Carol was quiet. "You know that name," Margaret said. "I know of it." Carol's voice was careful. "She's Romano's mistress. The necklace Amara found." "No," Margaret cut across her. "That's how she appears. But I worked organized crime for 12 years, Carol. I know that name from a different context entirely. Bianca Russo spent 3 years in the early part of this decade connected to the Ferrano family out of Philadelphia. She was identified in a federal wiretap as a courier, not a romantic attachment, an operative, moving information between families." She paused. "If she's with Romano now, it's either because she changed sides or because she was placed there." The silence on the line had a different quality now. "Placed by whom?" Carol said. "That's the question I'd want Amara to have the answer to," Margaret said, "before she spends another hour inside a DeLuca safe house." The car came at 7 exactly. Black Ford, 2 men, Marco and Deshawn, who identified themselves by name at the door the way Vincent had said they would. Amara had the babies ready, the duffel packed, the burner in her jacket pocket. She looked at the 2 men, and she thought about everything she'd been taught by 9 years of proximity to people whose business was controlling what other people knew and when they knew it. And she thought, you have no choice except to get in this car. Which was true. And which was also the thing that made her chest tight as she buckled Elias into the car seat in the back and settled Eden against her and pulled the door shut. They drove west on I-70, then connected to the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and the city fell away behind them and became suburbs, and then became the particular open geography of western Pennsylvania in winter, Long brown hills, bare trees against a gray sky, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. Marco drove without speaking. Deshawn sat in the passenger seat and looked at his phone. Nobody asked her anything. Nobody offered anything. The silence was professional and complete. She fed Eden in the back seat somewhere west of Breezewood. She looked out the window at the winter landscape, and she thought about Vincent DeLuca's voice on the phone at 5 in the morning. Calm, informational, moving pieces. And she thought about what he'd said about Damien coming himself, about the escalation that represented. And she thought about the 4 pages she'd handed across that table and what she'd given up by giving them. She thought, what do I actually know about Vincent DeLuca? What Margaret had told her? What Carol had arranged? The meeting in Fells Point where he'd been exactly what Margaret described. Precise, non-emotional, operating according to a code she could track, even if she didn't endorse it. He'd offered her something real. He'd moved quickly. He'd called her at 5 in the morning to warn her. These were the facts. They were also, she recognized, exactly the facts that a man who wanted her to trust him would arrange for her to have. She sat with that thought for a long time, watching the Pennsylvania hills pass, and she made herself keep sitting with it instead of dismissing it, because the version of herself that had married Damien Romano had been very good at dismissing things that made her uncomfortable, and she was done being that version. The house outside Ligonier was at the end of a gravel road, a long farmhouse set into a hillside with bare oaks along the front, and a barn that had been converted into what looked like a garage. No neighbors visible. The gravel road was the only approach. Marco pulled up to the front door and they all got out, and there was a third man there already waiting on the porch, who nodded at Marco and held the door. Inside was warm and plain. Wood floors, functional furniture, a fireplace that was already burning, a kitchen with the same kind of stocked refrigerator as the Ellicott City House, a crib upstairs, assembled. Amara walked through the rooms and she felt the isolation of it settle around her. Not unpleasantly, but completely. There was nothing out those windows in any direction except winter and hills and the silence of geography that was too far from everything to be convenient, which meant it was also too far from everything to leave easily. She put the babies down in the crib and came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen, and the burner phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a number she didn't recognize. Not the DeLuca line, not Margaret's. A number she'd never seen. She stood there for one full breath with the phone in her hand, and then she answered it. Who is this? A woman's voice, low, accented. New York Italian, the particular cadence of it. Careful. My name is Bianca Russo. Amara did not move. She did not speak. Every muscle in her body went to a specific kind of stillness that was the opposite of relaxation. I know who you are, Bianca said. I know where you are. And I need you to listen to me for about 3 minutes, because what I'm going to tell you is the thing that nobody else in this situation is going to tell you. How did you get this number? Amara's voice was flat and cold. Because I've been inside the DeLuca operation for 2 years, Bianca said. The same way I've been inside the Romano operation for 18 months, both at the same time. Neither of them knows about the other. The fire popped in the next room. Upstairs, one of the babies made a small sound. The winter through the kitchen window was gray and absolute. You're a double agent, Amara said. I'm a federal informant, Bianca said. Has been for 3 years. The necklace, the affair, all of it was constructed. I was placed inside Romano's operation by the FBI's Organized Crime Division 18 months ago. The relationship was the cover. A pause. The Romano family was the assignment. But 6 months in, I discovered something that changed the scope of the operation, and I reported it up the chain, and my handlers decided to expand it rather than close it. Amara's hand tightened on the phone. What did you discover? That Vincent DeLuca has been running his own financial operation parallel to Romano's for 4 years. Same mechanism. Offshore accounts, shell companies, money moving outside commission ledgers. Same theft from allied families. Her voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of a woman who has rehearsed this. Different scale. Romano was stealing tens of millions. DeLuca has been stealing hundreds of millions. He's been using Romano as a distraction, making noise about Romano's betrayal within the commission to keep the commission's attention focused on the smaller problem while the larger one continued. Amara stood in the kitchen of a DeLuca safe house in the middle of western Pennsylvania hills, and she felt the entire architecture of the past 48 hours tilt sideways and reassemble into a different shape. "The evidence he showed me," she said. "The documents in the folder." "Real," Bianca said. "Romano absolutely did what DeLuca says he did. But DeLuca showing you that evidence while simultaneously using your documentation to close his commission case against Romano, that's not him helping you. That's him using you to eliminate a rival while positioning himself as the last man standing." A pause. "The documentation you gave him doesn't just hurt Romano. It establishes a financial paper trail that, when DeLuca presents it to the commission, will be read alongside records that make it look like Romano was the sole architect of the fraud, which protects DeLuca's parallel operation entirely." Amar's throat was dry. "You're telling me I handed him exactly what he needed to cover himself. I'm telling you that by tomorrow morning, Vincent DeLuca will have enough to convene the commission, destroy Romano, and walk out of that room as the most powerful organized crime figure in New York, with no one left who knows what he's been doing for 4 years. Bianca's voice dropped slightly. "And I'm telling you that you are currently in a house that belongs to him, surrounded by his men, with the only documentation that could threaten him sitting in his possession." The fire in the next room was the only sound. "Why are you telling me this?" Amara said. A beat. "Because my operation just got pulled. My handlers decided the Romano case was enough. They're moving to arrest him within 72 hours, and they're closing my cover. Which means I'm done. And DeLuca doesn't get touched, and everything I've spent 2 years building against him disappears because nobody wants to extend the timeline." Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, more like the specific bitterness of a person who has done an enormous thing and watched it be reduced to something smaller. "I'm not in a position to go to the commission. I'm not in a position to go public, but you are." "I gave him the documents." "You gave him copies," Bianca said. "I'm asking if there are originals, notes, a second set." Amara looked at the duffel on the kitchen floor. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the 4 pages. The originals, handwritten, which she'd given to Vincent. She thought about the fact that she'd written every number and name from memory onto those pages, which meant the memory still existed, which meant, "There's no second set," she said carefully. "Then I'm asking you to reconstruct one. And I'm asking you to get out of that house before DeLuca realizes that you're not just a protected witness, you're a liability." Bianca's voice was flat now, stripped of everything except the essential shape of the situation. "He's a careful man. He'll realize it. Probably already is realizing it. You walked into his meeting with documentation of the same financial structure he's been running for 4 years. He's smart enough to know what you might eventually understand, and smart enough to act before you do." Amara looked at the kitchen door. She looked at the window with its view of the gravel drive and the bare oaks, and Marco standing at the corner of the house with his hands in his coat pockets, breath misting in the cold. She thought about Elias and Eden upstairs in the crib, in a house owned by a man who might, right now, be reconsidering the specific calculus of what she was worth to him alive versus what she represented as a risk. She thought about how far they were from anything, how one rode in and the same rode out. How the 2 men rotating at the perimeter were DeLuca's, not hers, had always been DeLuca's, and how she had walked into this house of her own volition, and how that volition had been built entirely on information she'd been given by a man who knew exactly what information to give her. "How do I reach you?" she said. "You don't," Bianca said. "You won't hear from me again. But there's a federal agent. His name is Carver. He works organized crime out of the New York field office. Not the same Carver who works for Romano. Different man, same name. I know how that sounds. His direct number is..." She gave a number. Amara repeated it in her head 4 times, then looked around the kitchen for something to write with, found a pen on the counter, and wrote the number on the inside of her wrist in small numerals. "He knows my name," she said. "He knows about you. He doesn't know you'll call." A pause. "Tell him Bianca sent you. He'll know what that means." The line went dead. Amara stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and the number on her wrist and the fire burning in the next room and the weight of what had just happened settling through her in cold layers. She'd come into this operation believing she was moving towards safety and had arrived instead at the center of a larger trap she hadn't known existed, carrying 2 infants and diminishing cash and the reconstructible contents of her own memory, which was the only asset she had left that hadn't been handed to someone who might want to use it against her. She picked up the duffel. She went upstairs and she lifted Eden from the crib, then Elias, moving quietly and quickly, and she got them into the carriers with the practiced speed of a woman who had been doing this in the dark for 48 hours. And she came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the front of the house through the window. Marco was still at the corner. The second man, she'd heard him referred to as Gio, was somewhere around the back. The Ford was parked in the drive. The keys were not in it. She'd noted that when she arrived. The gravel road ran a quarter-mile to the county road, which ran another 6 miles to the interstate. She was in a DeLuca house with DeLuca men and no car, and 2 babies in the Pennsylvania hills in December. And Vincent DeLuca was somewhere between Baltimore and New York, and the commission meeting he was convening would happen in less than 48 hours. And somewhere in the architecture of that meeting was the moment when her continued existence became a complication he'd need to address. She looked at the number on her wrist. She looked at the burner phone in her hand, the DeLuca line, the single program number that reached Vincent directly. She thought, you have maybe 2 hours before the calculation changes. Maybe less. She thought, you walked into this because you had no better option. Now you have to find one. She looked at Marco through the window, his back half turned, looking down the gravel road, and she moved to the kitchen counter and picked up the landline phone she'd seen mounted to the wall when she came in, and she dialed the number from her wrist, and she stood there with her son and daughter breathing against her body and her heart rate at a specific elevated steadiness that was not panic but lived very close to it, and the line rang once, twice, and on the third ring a man's voice answered, clipped and careful. Yes. My name is Amara Bennett, she said quietly. Bianca Russo told me to call you. I'm in a DeLuca safe house outside Ligonier, Pennsylvania, and I need you to listen to me very fast because I don't know how much time I have. The federal agent on the line didn't speak for 3 full seconds after she finished. She could hear him breathing, controlled, deliberate, the breath of a man running calculations in real time. How many DeLuca men at the location, he said. 2 visible, possibly a 3rd inside. I haven't confirmed. You're on a landline. Yes. DeLuca will have the number. If he pulls records, I know. She kept her voice low, one eye on the window where Marco was still positioned at the corner of the drive. I know. I need you to tell me if you can move on this. I need you to tell me what you have. Agent Carver's voice was flat and precise. Bianca's name gets you this conversation. It doesn't get you an extraction team. What do you have that I can use? Amara shifted Elias in the carrier. He was starting to fuss, the small precursor sounds that meant hunger was 20 minutes away. She pressed her palm flat against his back and kept her voice even. Financial records. Romano's offshore accounts, routing structures, the mechanism of how he moves money outside commission ledgers. I had them in writing, I gave the originals to DeLuca, but I wrote them from memory, and I can reconstruct them entirely. Every number, every name, every date. She paused. And I have information about DeLuca's parallel operation. Same structure, larger scale. I don't have documents on his side, but I have the shape of it, and I have Bianca's testimony connecting the two. Another silence. Bianca's testimony is complicated right now. I understand that. I'm telling you what I have. She looked at the number on her wrist. I also have 9 years of direct proximity to Damian Romano's operation. Conversations, names, dates, meetings. I'm not a document, I'm a witness, and I'm willing to be a cooperative one. She heard him exhale. Not frustration, something more like recalibration. Where exactly in Ligonier? She gave him the address from the mailbox she'd noted when the car pulled in. She heard him typing. I can have people at your location in 4 hours, he said. I don't have 4 hours. She said it quietly and clearly. I have maybe 90 minutes before DeLuca reviews the phone records for this property and realizes I've made a call to a number I wasn't supposed to have. At that point, His men stop being my protection and start being my problem. She looked at the duffel on the floor, at the kitchen door, at the cold window. I need less than 4 hours. 2.5, he said. That's what I can do. She thought about 90 minutes versus 2.5 hours. She thought about the gap between those numbers and what could happen inside it. Tell me how to stay safe for 2.5 hours in a house with 2 armed men who are about to realize I'm a liability, she said. Don't give them a reason to realize it yet. His voice was direct. Stay visible. Stay normal. If they check on you, you're feeding the babies. You're resting. You don't run. You don't barricade. You don't do anything that signals you know what's coming. The moment they think you're onto them, the situation changes faster than I can respond to. He paused. Can you do that? She looked at the kitchen. She looked at her children. She thought about what normal looked like when you were standing in a DeLuca farmhouse in Pennsylvania with a federal agent's number written on your wrist. Yes, she said. 2.5 hours. Don't call this number again from the landline. He ended the call. She set the phone back in its cradle on the wall as if it had always been there, and she turned and opened the refrigerator and took out the formula and began to heat it on the stove because Elias needed to eat, and the most functional thing she could do with her hands for the next 2.5 hours was take care of her children, which was also the truest thing and the thing she was best at, and the thing that had sustained her through everything else, so she did it. Marco came in at 8:15 to check on her. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her sitting at the table, feeding Elias with the bottle, and Eden propped against her thigh. And he said, "You need anything?" with the flat professionalism of a man performing a task. And she said, "We're fine, thank you," with the equivalent flatness. And he left. She sat at the table and fed her son and watched the clock above the stove, and she did not look at the number on her wrist, and she did not think about the gap between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, and she focused on Elias's face, the absolute absorption of an infant being fed, the way his eyes tracked up to hers and held there with that pure unfiltered attention that infants have before the world teaches them to filter it. At 8:47, her burner phone buzzed, the DeLuca line. She answered it. "How are you settling in?" Vincent's voice, the same register as always. "We're comfortable," she said. "The babies slept." "Good." A pause that was almost nothing. "I wanted to let you know, the commission meeting is confirmed. Day after tomorrow, morning session. Once it concludes, your situation resolves." Another pause, slightly longer. "I'll need you available by phone during the meeting, in case any member wants to hear directly from you." "Of course," she said. "Good." His voice hadn't changed. It never changed. That was the thing. "Get some rest." He ended the call. She set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the clock. 8:49. 1 hour and 41 minutes since she'd called Carver. The call from Vincent had been a check. She understood that completely and immediately. He hadn't called to reassure her or update her. He'd called to hear her voice, to take her temperature, to determine whether the woman in his Pennsylvania farmhouse was still the cooperative witness he'd installed there or had become something else. And she had passed the check, or performed passing it, which in this situation amounted to the same thing. But the check told her something. It told her he was monitoring more carefully than he had been 24 hours ago, which meant the timeline Bianca had described, the narrowing window before she became a liability, was compressing faster than she'd calculated. She looked at Marco through the window. He'd moved from the corner of the drive to the porch, which put him closer to the front door. She looked at the clock. She fed Eden. At 9:50, a car came down the gravel road. She heard it before she saw it, tires on frozen gravel, the specific crunch of it. And she stood from the table with Eden still in her arms and moved to the window, and the car that came into view was not a federal vehicle. It was a black SUV, the same model and color as the one that had sat outside the Dundalk shelter at 6 in the morning on December 26th. It stopped in the drive behind the Ford, and the doors opened, and Damian Romano got out. She felt the sight of him like a physical impact. Not fear exactly, something more primal and more complicated than fear. The specific visceral response of a body that has spent 9 years calibrating itself to the presence of a particular person. He was wearing the same dark overcoat. He looked up at the house and his face was the face she knew, composed, still, entirely devoid of the performance of emotion. He looked at Marco on the porch and said something she couldn't hear through the glass. She stepped back from the window. Her mind was running very fast in a very specific direction. This is not possible. DeLuca's men had brought her here. DeLuca's men were at the perimeter. Damian Romano should not be able to drive down this road without those men stopping him. Which meant one of two things. Either Damian had found the location through his own resources and had already neutralized DeLuca's perimeter, or DeLuca's men had let him in. Neither option was good. The second option was catastrophic in a specific way she didn't have time to fully process. She moved. She picked up Elias from the table where she'd set him for a moment, got him into the front carrier fast, Eden already against her chest, both babies secured. She picked up the duffel. She went to the back of the house, kitchen, through the door to the utility room, to the back door that opened onto a wooden deck, and beyond it the winter yard, and beyond that the tree line, maybe 60 yards out. She put her hand on the back door handle. She heard the front door open. Marco's voice, from the front of the house. "She's in the kitchen." Then footsteps on the wood floor. She opened the back door and went through it and pulled it shut behind her and moved across the deck and down the 3 steps to the frozen ground. And she started walking toward the tree line, fast, not running. Running would make noise on the frozen grass. Running would make the babies cry. Walking as fast as she could with 2 infants strapped to her body and a duffel on her shoulder in December in Pennsylvania with no car and no phone except a burner that she could not use and a number on her wrist for a man who was still 40 minutes out at minimum. She heard the back door open behind her. She ran. Elias startled against her chest and made a sharp sound, and she wrapped one arm around him as she ran, and Eden was crying now, the cold air on her face triggering it, and Amara's boots hit the frozen ground in long strides, and the tree line was 40 yards away and she could hear footsteps behind her, not running yet, someone who hadn't decided yet whether to run, and then a voice. "Amara!" Damian's voice. Not shouted. The same register as always, which was somehow worse than a shout. She did not stop. "Amara!" Closer now. He was moving. "Stop. I'm not going to hurt you." She hit the tree line and kept going, into the dark of the bare winter oaks, branches catching at her coat, her feet finding uneven ground under the snow, and she went another 30 yards into the trees and ducked behind the wide trunk of an oak that was old enough to provide real cover, and she pressed her back against it and held both babies against her body and tried to control her breathing while Eden cried and Elias made the distressed high sound that meant he was frightened. She could hear him in the trees, footsteps on snow, deliberate. Not panicked. He wasn't panicked. He was never panicked. She pressed harder against the tree trunk and put her mouth close to Eden's head and made the low, continuous sound that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. And after a moment, Eden's crying reduced to a broken hiccuping, and Elias went quieter, turned his face into her neck. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The trees, the cold, the distant sound of a crow somewhere above. Then his voice, maybe 20 feet away to her left. "I know you're here. I can hear them." A pause. "Come out. I swear to you, I just want to talk." She said nothing. She calculated. The tree line ran along the back of the property. She'd seen it from the car coming in. It was a stand of maybe 200 yards before it hit a fence line, and beyond that a field. No cover in the field. She didn't know what was beyond the field. She didn't know where the county road was relative to her position in the trees. She didn't know if Carver was 20 minutes out or 40. She had 2 babies and a dead-end tree line, and Damian Romano 20 feet to her left. She stepped out from behind the oak. He was standing in a small clearing, his dark coat gray with cold light coming through the bare branches. He looked at her, and then at the babies against her body. And something moved through his face that she had not seen there in a very long time and could not cleanly name. Not softness, not guilt. Something older and less articulate than either of those things. "How did you find me?" she said. Her voice was steady. She needed it steady. "DeLuca told me." He said it without hesitation, which was how she knew it was true. Damian only hesitated about things he was constructing. "He called me this morning." She absorbed this. "He called you." "He called me," Damian said. That surprises you. Tell me why he called you. Damien looked at her across the clearing. His hands were in his coat pockets. He hadn't come at her. He was standing at the edge of the clearing and holding that distance, which was deliberate, which was the performance of being non-threatening, but she'd seen that performance before. Because you have something he wants completely controlled, and he's not sure you're sufficiently controlled. And because I'm the mechanism he can use to close that gap. He paused. He told me where you were and told me to retrieve you before his commission meeting, with the understanding that your documentation goes into the meeting as evidence, and you don't survive to contradict whatever version of events DeLuca presents afterward. The cold in the trees was absolute. Amara's breath came out in visible clouds. Elias had his fist wrapped in the fabric of her collar. And you came, she said. I came. He held her gaze. Not to do what he asked. Then what? His jaw moved. She watched it. The specific tension of a man choosing words with unusual care, a man who ordinarily didn't choose words because he didn't need to, because his words had weight by default, and he'd long since stopped having to earn that weight. You've been 3 steps ahead of me since you left, he said. I want you to know I understand that. What you built, the records, the network of people you moved through, the meeting with DeLuca. He paused. I underestimated you for a long time. Don't, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to come back. I know what the necklace was. I know what these 2 years were. Another pause. Harder. I know what the whole thing was, and I'm not standing here to defend it. He took 1 step toward her and stopped. But DeLuca is going to kill you. That's what this is now. I'm telling you because you're the mother of my children, and because whatever I did to this marriage, you don't deserve to die in a Pennsylvania field. Amara looked at him across the 20 feet of frozen ground, and she thought about 9 years and what they weighed and how much of that weight was real, and how much was the accumulated residue of a story she'd told herself because the alternative was unbearable. And she thought about the necklace in the velvet box and her handwriting on the note she'd left on his pillow, and the specific silence of the Fifth Avenue penthouse at 2 a.m. How many men did you bring? She said. 4. And DeLuca has Marco and Gio at this house. Had. My men have them. He said it flatly. They're not hurt. They're in the barn. She looked at him. You're offering to get me out. I'm telling you that DeLuca's commission meeting is in 36 hours, and that if you're alive and free when it happens, you can still act. If you're in that house when he decides you're too dangerous to keep around. He stopped. He looked at Elias against her chest, the baby's dark eyes tracking him with the serious attention of a child who didn't know yet what to make of this man but was working on it. Something in Damien's face did the thing it had done when he first looked at them. That unnameable thing, older than strategy. There are federal agents coming, she said. She said it the way you put a card on the table, not to threaten, to inform. 40 minutes, maybe 30 now? He was very still. You called them? Yes. When? This morning, before you got here. She watched his face. Whatever you're calculating right now, they know about DeLuca. They know about his operation. They know about the commission meeting. Whoever is in that room in 36 hours is going to be walking into something. His jaw tightened. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The specific rapid reassessment of a man who has just discovered the board is different from what he thought. If federal agents are coming to this location, you need to decide what you want to be when they get here, she said. That's what I'm telling you. He looked at her. The trees were very still around them, the cold very absolute, and Damien Romano stood in a winter clearing in Pennsylvania with his children 10 feet away in their mother's arms, and the full weight of 11 years of choices compressing into this particular moment, and she watched him feel it. Not perform feeling it. Actually feel it. Which was perhaps the first time she had ever seen that happen in his face with this clarity. The federal agent's name, he said, Carver, Organized Crime, New York Field Office. If I cooperate, I don't know what they'll offer you, she said honestly. I'm not in a position to negotiate for them. But I know what happens if you go back to DeLuca, and I know what happens if you run, and I know what happens if you're standing in this clearing with me when they arrive and you've got your hands where they can see them. She paused. Those are the options. He stood there for a long moment. The crow called again somewhere above them, harsh and distant. She watched his face go through something complex and private, the dismantling of a self-conception she suspected he'd held so long he'd stopped examining it, and she felt for it. Not for him, not for what he'd done, but for the specific human weight of a moment when the person you've been stops being sustainable. Then he reached into his coat, and he took out his phone and he held it toward her. "Call him," he said. "Tell him I'm here and I'm cooperating. Tell him I want a conversation before anyone approaches this location." She took the phone. She looked at him for another moment. "The babies," he said. His voice was different now, lower, stripped of the performance of control. Are they all right?" "They're cold," she said, "and they need to get inside." He nodded once. He stepped back and she moved past him through the trees toward the house, and he followed, and behind them the winter closed back over the clearing as if nothing in it had happened. Inside the farmhouse, she laid both babies on the couch and covered them with the blanket from the back of the sofa, and she picked up her burner phone and called Carver's number, and he answered on the first ring, and she said, "Damian Romano is here. He came voluntarily. He says he wants to cooperate. I need you to accelerate your timeline, and I need you to come in calm because I have 2 7-month-old children in this building, and I need this to go a specific way." Carver said, 20 minutes. She said, "Okay." She set the phone down. She looked at Damian, who was standing across the room from her with his hands at his sides, and the distance between them was 10 feet and 11 years, and everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. And she looked at him with the full clarity of a woman who has stopped telling herself a story she doesn't believe. "Sit down," she said. "We're going to wait." He sat down. She stood by the window. Outside, the gravel drive was empty, and the Pennsylvania winter was gray and enormous, and in approximately 20 minutes, if Carver was as good as his word, everything was going to change in a way that nothing could walk back from. Not for Damian, not for DeLuca, not for the Romano organization, or the commission, or the architecture of power that had defined her life for 9 years. And not for her. She looked at her children on the couch. Elias had his eyes open, watching the ceiling. Eden had gone to sleep with the immediate animal faith of an infant who has been fed and is warm and trusts that this is sufficient. The gravel crunched. Not one car. Multiple cars, the sound of them coming fast down the road, and through the winter bare trees she could see the lights. Not sirens, no sirens. They'd been smart enough to come without sirens. And then the vehicles were in the drive, and the doors were opening, and men in tactical gear were fanning out across the property, and a man in a dark jacket who was not in tactical gear was walking toward the front door with his badge held at shoulder height and his eyes already on the window where she was standing. Carver. 45, compact, the face of a man who had spent 2 decades learning to read rooms faster than the rooms could change. She opened the front door before he reached it. He looked at her face, at the babies on the couch behind her, at Damian Romano sitting in the chair across the room with his hands on his knees, and he took it all in with the rapid, comprehensive attention of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of scene, and he said, without preamble, "Is anyone hurt?" "No," she said. "The DeLuca men. In the barn. Unharmed." He nodded. He looked past her at Damian. "Mr. Romano." His voice was level. "I understand you want to talk." Damian looked up at him from the chair. His face was tired, actually tired, not the controlled surface of a man managing his exhaustion, but the real thing, the face of a man who has reached the other side of what he was capable of sustaining. "I want a lawyer," he said, "and then I'll talk." Carver looked at Amara. Something in his expression acknowledged what she had done. Not effusively, not even warmly, just a straight professional recognition of the specific thing she had pulled off in the past 12 hours. "There's a vehicle outside for you and the children," he said. "My partner will stay with you. You're not going anywhere until we've talked, but you'll be warm, and your kids will be safe." "DeLuca," she said. "The commission meeting." "We know about the meeting." He held her gaze. We've known about DeLuca for longer than you might think. What you gave us today." He stopped. He wasn't a man who over-explained. "It matters. What you did matters." She nodded once. She picked up Eden, then Elias, settled them against her body, picked up the duffel that had been on her shoulder or within arm's reach for 3 days now, and she walked to the door and through it and into the cold Pennsylvania morning, where federal agents moved across the gravel drive and the barn doors were open and Marco and Gio were being let out with their hands behind their backs. And somewhere in New York City, Vincent DeLuca was making phone calls and tightening logistics for a commission meeting that was already, without his knowing it, a trap built from the inside out. She got into the vehicle. The agent Carver had mentioned, a woman, younger, dark coat, was already in the driver's seat, and she turned and looked at Amara and the babies with a straightforward human decency and said, "There's a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. It's probably still hot." Amara reached for it. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the full-body decompression of 72 hours of sustained crisis beginning to release its grip on her nervous system, the specific physical consequence of a body that has been running on adrenaline and decision-making and raw will and has just been told, by circumstance, that it is allowed to stop. She poured coffee into the thermos cap and wrapped both hands around it and looked through the windshield at the farmhouse where Damian Romano was about to begin talking to a federal agent for the first time in his life, and she thought about the commission meeting in 36 hours, and Vincent DeLuca walking into it believing he had won, and what was going to be waiting for him there instead, and she felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean, too finished, but was perhaps the first recognizable outline of what came after. Elias was watching the farmhouse through the window with his grave infant attention. She put her hand on the back of his head, light and warm. "Okay," she said, to him, to both of them, to no one. "We're okay." The commission meeting was held in a private dining room on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that housed, on its lower floors, a legitimate real estate investment firm, and on its upper floors, the kind of meeting spaces that could be rented without paperwork and accessed by elevator with a key that didn't appear in any building directory. 12 men came. Old families, old money, old grievances. They arrived in separate cars at staggered intervals the way they always did, because the commission had not survived this long by being visible. And they sat around a table that had seen 30 years of decisions made in the particular register of men who understood that what happened in this room had consequences that no court would ever formally acknowledge. Vincent DeLuca arrived at 9:50, 10 minutes before the scheduled start. He was composed, clean-shaved, wearing a dark suit that was neither expensive enough to be ostentatious nor cheap enough to be noticed. He had a leather portfolio under his arm containing the documentation he'd spent 2 years assembling, supplemented by 4 pages of handwritten financial records that a woman named Amara had handed him across a table in a closed restaurant on Christmas night. He shook hands with 3 men before he sat down. He poured himself water. He looked like a man who had already decided how the morning would go. He had not yet noticed the 2 men seated near the back of the room, whom he did not recognize. The meeting was called to order by the commission's senior member, a man named Augusto Ferrara, who was 74 years old and had the specific gravity of someone who had outlasted everyone who ever underestimated him. He looked around the table with the slow attention of a man who saw everything and registered most of it before speaking. "There's a matter before this body," Ferrara said, "that concerns the financial integrity of operations under commission oversight. Vincent has asked to present." He looked at DeLuca. "Go ahead." DeLuca opened the portfolio. He began to speak, measured, precise, the presentation of a man who had rehearsed this without making it sound rehearsed. He laid out the Romano case, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the money moving outside commission ledgers, the theft from allied families, the numbers and dates and routing structures that constituted 3 years of financial betrayal. He presented it as a complete record, thorough and damning, and the men around the table listened with the focused attention of people to whom this information was both unsurprising and significant. He was 14 minutes into the presentation when Ferrara held up one hand. DeLuca stopped. "Before you continue," Ferrara said, and his voice was the same, even, measured, old, "I want to note that we have 2 guests. He looked toward the two men near the back of the room. Invited by me, with the agreement of 3 other members under the Commission's provision for external review when the matter under discussion involves potential misconduct by a presenting member. The room went very still. DeLuca's face did not change, which was itself a kind of change. The absence of the adjustment that an innocent man would make. The slight confusion, the beginning of a question. Instead, his face held. And that holding was the tell. One of the 2 men near the back stood. He was 45, compact, dark jacket. He set a folder on the table and slid it toward the center. "My name is Carver," he said. "I work organized crime, federal level. I'm not here to arrest anyone in this room today, and I'm not here to make representations about any ongoing investigation. I'm here as a resource, at the Commission's request, to provide context on a specific set of financial records." He looked at DeLuca with the flat professional attention of a man who has spent 2 decades in rooms where everyone was lying and has become very good at finding the specific texture of it. "Mr. DeLuca, the documentation you're presenting this morning, the Romano accounts, can you tell this body how those records came into your possession?" DeLuca looked at Carver. He looked at Ferrara. He looked at the folder in the center of the table that he had not opened. "Through my own organization's intelligence operation," he said. "Developed over 2 years. And a supplemental set of records provided to you 4 days ago by a woman named Amara Bennett." A beat. 1 second. 2. "She provided information voluntarily," DeLuca said, "as a witness to Romano's operations. She provided it under the belief that you were acting as a neutral party in opposition to her husband," Carver said. "Not under the belief that you were using her documentation to complete a case that would simultaneously eliminate a rival and obscure your own parallel financial operation." He paused. "The folder in the center of the table contains records from 4 offshore accounts that don't appear in any Romano filing and don't appear in any DeLuca filing but are structured identically to both. Same shell company architecture, same routing jurisdictions, same timing patterns." He looked at the commission members. "They're DeLuca accounts, running for 4 years. Approximately $260 million moved outside commission oversight during that period." The room was completely silent. DeLuca set his pen down on the table. He set it down carefully, the way you put something down when your hands need to be doing something and there is nothing useful for them to do. He looked at the folder. He looked at Ferrara. "This is a fabrication," he said, "assembled by a woman whose husband has every reason to—" "The records were verified independently," Carver said, "by 2 forensic accountants retained by 3 commission members acting in concert. The verification was completed yesterday." He picked up his own folder. "Additionally, a witness who has been cooperating with federal authorities for the past 3 years has provided testimony connecting Mr. DeLuca's operation to the same offshore structure. That witness's testimony was provided to this body in writing prior to this meeting, under seal, reviewed by Mr. Ferrara and 2 other members." DeLuca looked at Ferrara. And in that look, in the quality of it, the shift from presentation to something raw and more exposed. Every man in the room saw the answer to the question they'd come in not yet knowing they had. "The witness," DeLuca said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was a different kind now. The control of effort rather than of nature. "Bianca Russo." "Among others," Carver said. DeLuca sat back in his chair. He did something then that none of the men in the room had ever seen him do in 14 years of commission meetings. He closed his eyes briefly for perhaps 2 seconds and then opened them again. It was the gesture of a man absorbing a weight he'd known theoretically could arrive and was discovering was heavier than the theory had prepared him for. Ferrara looked at him across the table with the 74-year-old eyes of a man who has made every kind of decision this life required and has learned to make them without theater. "Vincent," he said, quietly, not unkindly, "the way you speak to someone you have known for a long time when the thing that had to happen has finally happened." DeLuca looked at him. "Step outside," Ferrara said. DeLuca stepped outside. The commission deliberated for 53 minutes. Carver and his colleague waited in a separate room down the hall. And when the door opened and Ferrara's assistant came to find them, Carver went in alone. He was in there for 11 minutes. When he came out, he made a phone call. The call went to a federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan where Damian Romano had been processed the previous afternoon, where he was sitting in a room with his attorney and the very specific expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the person other people feared and is discovering what it feels like to be on the other side of that equation. The call was brief. Carver told him that DeLuca had been stripped of his commission standing and that the commission had formally voted to cooperate with federal investigation into both operations, which was unprecedented and which meant the legal walls were going up faster than any attorney could work. He told him that his cooperation, the conversation he'd had in the Pennsylvania farmhouse and the 7 hours of recorded statement he'd given afterward, was being evaluated by the U.S. Attorney's Office and that they would be in contact within 48 hours with a formal offer. Damian listened. When Carver finished, he said, "My children." "They're with their mother," Carver said. "They're safe." A pause on the line. Long enough that Carver almost spoke again. Then Damian said, "Tell her," and stopped. Another pause. "Tell her I said they have her eyes." Carver said he would pass that along. He ended the call, and he stood for a moment in the hallway outside the commission room with the noise of a midtown morning coming up from the street below, and he thought about the specific category of damage that a man like Damian Romano left in the world. Not just the crime, not just the money and the violence and the corruption, but the quieter damage, the kind that took years to see the full shape of. And he thought about the woman who had walked out of that penthouse in the snow with 2 infants on her body and $600 in a bag and had, in 72 hours and against every structural advantage her husband possessed, dismantled his empire from the outside in. He didn't have a word for that. He was not a man who reached for words about things. He put his phone in his pocket and went to find his partner. The custody hearing was held in family court in Baltimore in the second week of January, because that was the jurisdiction where Amara had formally established temporary residence, and because her attorney, Margaret Osei, who had come out of retirement for precisely this case and who appeared in the courtroom with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for the right occasion, had filed with the speed and precision of someone who understood that legal ground, once taken, was the most durable kind. The Romano family's attorneys appeared and presented their emergency custody petition, which had been filed in New York on Christmas Day and which was now 6 weeks old and had accrued significant procedural problems in the interim, given that the petitioner was currently in federal custody and the supporting affidavit describing the respondent as an unstable and erratic mother had been authored by a man whose own instability and criminality was now a matter of very extensive public record. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead when she wasn't reading, and she read the Romano petition with the expression of a person reviewing something that had been submitted in good faith at a time when the underlying facts were substantially different from what they were now. She set it down. She looked at the courtroom. She awarded temporary full custody to Amara pending the completion of a home study and a 90-day review period. She issued a protective order. She scheduled the permanent custody determination for April. Amara sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to the order being read, and she did not cry, because she had discovered over the past 6 weeks that the version of herself that existed now was not a version that cried easily or often, not because she'd become hard, but because she'd become economical. She spent her resources on the things that required them, and crying in a courtroom in January was not one of those things. She signed what Margaret put in front of her to sign. She shook Margaret's hand. She walked out of the courthouse into a January afternoon that was cold and gray and ordinary, and Delia was waiting on the courthouse steps with the double stroller containing both babies, and Amara came down the steps and crouched in front of the stroller and looked at Elias and Eden, who were bundled in their winter suits and looking back at her with the grave, attentive faces of 2 people who had been on a significant journey and had no framework yet for understanding it, but had been present for every mile of it. She put one hand on each of them, her palm on Elias's chest, her fingers brushing Eden's cheek. And she stayed like that for a moment with the courthouse behind her, and the January street in front of her and Delia standing quietly to the side, in the way of a friend who understands when a moment belongs to someone else. Then she stood up. "Okay," she said. "Let's go home." Delia said, Which home? You have approximately 3 options right now. Amara almost smiled. Almost. The apartment. She'd signed a lease on a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood in northwest Baltimore that was quiet and had old trees and a park within walking distance, and she'd used the last of the emergency cash for the deposit and the first month's rent and had applied for a position at a healthcare nonprofit that Margaret knew the director of, managing financial operations, which was a job she was more qualified for than she'd given herself credit for being. She knew numbers. She knew how money moved and where it hid and what it cost to move it. Those skills, it turned out, were transferable. She pushed the stroller down the courthouse steps, and Delia walked beside her, and they went to Delia's car and got the babies in and drove through Baltimore in January, through the neighborhoods that were neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply real, the particular realness of a city that didn't perform for anyone. Bianca Russo testified in federal proceedings in February. She testified for 3 days, and she was precise and thorough, and the testimony was difficult in the way all testimony is difficult when it requires a person to lay out in plain declarative sentences the full account of what they did and why and what it cost. She had been under federal protection since December 27th. She was not a sympathetic figure in the conventional sense. She had deceived everyone systematically for 3 years, but she was an honest one in the proceedings, which is a different thing. And the combination of her testimony and the documentary evidence and Amara's cooperation and Damien's eventual full cooperation under a negotiated agreement produced a federal case that the U.S. Attorney's Office described in the press conference they held in March as the most significant organized crime prosecution in the district in 20 years. Vincent DeLuca was indicted on 47 counts. The commission's decision to cooperate with the federal investigation, unprecedented, and the subject of considerable analysis in the weeks that followed, had effectively removed the protective architecture that would ordinarily have made prosecution enormously difficult. He was held without bail. His attorney filed motions for 6 months and lost all of them. Damien Romano pleaded to a negotiated set of charges that carried a mandatory minimum of 12 years. His attorney had worked for 4 months to get that number as low as it was, and it was as low as it was because of the scope and value of his cooperation, which had been extensive. He was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania in April. He was 44 years old. Amara learned the sentence from Margaret, who called her on a Tuesday morning in April while she was at her desk at the nonprofit going through a quarterly financial report. She set the phone down after the call and looked at the window for a moment. The April light in Baltimore, specific and pale, coming through the glass at a low angle and lying in a strip across the floor. 12 years. She turned the number over in her mind without performing a reaction to it. 12 years was long. 12 years was also not permanent, which meant it was not a closed door, which meant there was a version of the future that involved Damien Romano somewhere on the edges of her children's lives. And she had spent the past 3 months accepting that without flinching from it, because flinching didn't change it. And Elias and Eden deserved a mother who could look at the complicated truth of their father without blinking. She thought about what he'd said through Carver in the Pennsylvania farmhouse. They have her eyes. She'd turned that over for 3 months, too. She hadn't sent a message back. She hadn't needed to. What there was to say between them had been said in a note left on a pillow on Christmas Eve, and the 12 intervening years would say the rest. She went back to the quarterly report. The April custody hearing produced a permanent order that gave Amara sole legal and physical custody of Elias and Eden Romano, with supervised visitation provisions for their father that would not become relevant for the duration of his sentence and would be revisited by the court when and if circumstances changed. The Romano family's attorneys, a different set now, the original team having withdrawn when the size and direction of the criminal case became clear, made a formal appearance and filed no objection. Amara walked out of that courthouse into an April afternoon that was warm, the first really warm day of the year, the kind of warmth that comes in April in the mid-Atlantic, like a statement after a very long argument. She had the stroller this time herself, no Delia, and she pushed it down the courthouse steps and onto the sidewalk, and she stood in the April sun for a moment with her children in front of her, and the weight of the order in her bag, and she felt the specific sensation of a thing that has been in motion for a long time finally arriving at rest. Not peace, Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But rest. The particular rest of a person who has stopped running, not because they've given up, but because they've arrived somewhere. She pushed the stroller down the sidewalk. The trees on the courthouse block were budding, the particular pale green of early April leaves, and the light came through them and moved on the pavement in the small, restless patterns of light through new leaves. And Elias was watching it from the stroller with his very serious face, tracking the movement the way he tracked everything now, with the focused attention of a baby who was becoming a person with specific preferences and a recognizable sense of humor and a way of grabbing her face with both hands when he wanted her attention that she had no defenses against whatsoever. Eden was asleep, which was what Eden did in the stroller, accepted movement as an invitation to rest, which seemed like wisdom. She thought about the morning she'd left, the hallway of the penthouse, the coat with the velvet box in the pocket, the note she'd written in less than a minute because there weren't that many words to say. She thought about standing at the window with her coffee, looking down at Fifth Avenue in the sleet, and the specific sensation of a decision being made inside her before she'd consciously authorized it. She thought about Marco at the lobby desk with his half-asleep face and the revolving door and the cold hitting her on the other side of it like a wall. She thought about everything that the cold had given way to. She stopped at the corner and waited for the light, and a woman with a dog passed and nodded at the stroller in the automatic way of strangers acknowledging babies, and Amara nodded back, and the light changed and she crossed the street. She had a meeting at 2 o'clock at the nonprofit, a budget review that she'd been preparing for since Monday, a straightforward piece of work that required attention and competence and no other particular thing, which was the kind of work she'd discovered she was hungry for. The work that asked of you only what you actually had. She'd applied for permanent status at the organization in March and had been offered the position the following week, and she'd accepted it sitting at the kitchen table in the Northwest Baltimore apartment while the twins slept in the next room, and the March afternoon came through the window clean and ordinary. She'd accepted it without drama, without the particular performance of gratitude she'd spent years practicing for situations that didn't warrant it. Just, yes, this now. She turned onto the block where she'd parked and stopped beside her car, a used Honda, not particularly new, with a car seat base already installed on each side of the back seat. And she lifted Eden first, the practice motion completely automatic now, her body knowing exactly the angles and the weight, and she got her secured, and then Elias, who grabbed her thumb as she clicked his buckle and held it for a moment before letting go. She folded the stroller and put it in the trunk, and got in the driver's seat and sat for a moment with the April sun through the windshield before starting the engine. She thought about Vincent DeLuca in a federal facility awaiting trial. She thought about Bianca Russo, somewhere under a new name in a city that wasn't New York, beginning whatever came next for a person who had been Bianca Russo. She thought about Carol in the Dundalk row house and Margaret Osai in Roland Park, and Delia in her apartment in Baltimore, who had picked up a phone call on Christmas morning and answered on the second ring and been exactly what she said she would be, which was the rarest and most essential thing. She thought about the woman who had stood in a bathroom off the master suite of a Fifth Avenue penthouse and opened a velvet box and sat on the cold marble floor and counted 11 minutes. She thought about that woman with a specific tenderness that was not nostalgia. She didn't miss her, didn't want to go back to being her, but was something more like recognition. That woman had known, underneath all the stories she'd been telling herself, what the story actually was. She'd known it and carried it and waited until the weight of it was something she could act on rather than something that would crush her. And then she had acted. That was worth something. That was, in fact, the thing that had made all the rest possible. She started the car. She pulled out of the parking space and onto the street and drove through the April Baltimore afternoon toward her 2 o'clock meeting, with her children in the back seat and the windows cracked because the day was warm enough for it, and the air that came through the gap was clean and ordinary and held the particular smell of April, something green coming, something beginning. And she drove through it with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road ahead, not looking in the rear-view mirror. She didn't need to. There was nothing behind her now that required watching. The road was in front of her, and she was on it, and that was enough.